September 15th, 1940. 10:17 a.m., 5 miles east of Maidstone, Kent, England. The sky had been a hard blue all morning, the kind of blue that made men think of summer even as sirens still tasted on the air. A single Messerschmitt Bf-109 screamed over the patchwork of hedgerows and orchards, its canopy a sunlit glint for a moment before it yawed, coughing black smoke. In the cockpit, Oberleutnant Karl Weiß fought with the throttle and the stick like a man trying to wrestle a wild animal back into the leash. The instrument panel was a mess of sputtering needles. Oil slicked across the glass with an angry sheen. He smelled the metal-hot tang of burning fabric and the acrid sting of petrol. The engine choked and the whole aircraft shuddered as if it were trying to shrug him off. Karl unfastened his harness with hands that trembled more from concentration than fear. The parachute, an orange folded promise, felt foreign in his palms, heavier with the knowledge of what would come once it opened. Beside him, the radio crackled with fragments of orders and static, German voices frayed at the edges by distance. He didn't hear the distant rumble of RAF fighters or the thud of his own pulse. He heard the steady click of his boots against the cockpit floor as he pushed off the shattered frame and tumbled into cold air. Below, the English countryside descended like a stage set. Orchards, hedgerows, a scattering of cottages whose chimneys traced thin blue lines into the sky. The wind grabbed his chute and turned it inside out with a violent jerk. For a suspended instant, Karl saw the ground as a geography of patchwork fields and sheep, of beehives and half-hidden lanes, an ordinary life mapped out in pastoral detail. Then the canopy steadied and he hung, exposed and small, while somewhere far away the war still bled across the skies. He landed hard in a plowed field, the impact knocking the breath from his chest and leaving him staring up at the sky like a man who had been given back his life without permission. The Messerschmitt cartwheeled behind him and went silent, a blackened tooth lodged in the hedge. Karl's leather flying jacket was scorched at the shoulder, the Luftwaffe insignia singed but still visible. He forced himself to his knees, fingers fumbling for the Mauser pistol that had never left his hip. Habit, not hope, guided the motion. A scatter of people converged. No orderly lines of soldiers. No triumphant squadrons, just neighbors and harvesters and a pair of uniformed figures who moved with the slow, official air of civil defense. Private Jack Collins of the local Home Guard, his face freckled and sunburnt, was first, followed by an ARP warden with a high flat cap and a clipboard. They approached with hands raised, not in surrender but in an awkward courtesy that matched the oddness of the moment. An enemy pilot, grounded and human, blinking in the English sun. Hands where we can see him. "Mate," Jack said in a voice more curious than hostile. He wasn't carrying a rifle, only a length of rope and a stout walking stick, but his posture suggested someone used to shooing off stray animals. Karl, still tasting petrol on his tongue, obeyed. The pistol remained at his side. He did not reach for it. Around them, villagers had gathered. Women with aprons tied, men in muddy boots, children perched on fence posts. A woman in her 30s, hair pinned back tight, held a child close and stared with a look that mixed fascination and an almost painful politeness. The first bewilderment on the downed pilot's face was not fear, but a stunned dissonance. He had been trained to expect shouts and jeers, a chorus of hatred cultivated by radio and uniform. Instead, the man who stepped forward carried a tin of cigarettes and a kettle looped over his arm. Reverend Thomas Hale from the parish, an older man, with a soft voice and strong hands, had been first to see the parachute bloom above the field and had come running with a thermos and ham sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper. They bound Karl's wrists with rough twine, not harsh, just practical, then helped him to his feet. Someone produced a blanket. Someone else offered water. The pilot's jaw worked. He blinked through the fog of adrenaline and watched as Mrs. Margaret Turner, who ran the village bakery, approached with a paper-wrapped loaf and a tin of biscuits. She held them out as if offering them to a child. The act was so ordinary, so shockingly humane, that the air in Karl's chest shifted. He heard the small click of a match as a cigarette was lit for him, and the smoke curled around his face like a pale, absurd halo. When Reverend Hale, his collar dusted with flour from earlier bread-making, placed a cup of tea in Karl's hands, the pilot's fingers closed over china the way they might have closed over a comrade's hand in a foxhole. The tea smelled faintly of bergamot. It was not a drink of war but of domestic ritual. Jack Collins, thinking pragmatically, offered him a cigarette as well, and Karl accepted, the gesture simple and reciprocal. Around them, children craned their necks, whispering in amazement that the man who had been painting the air with bombs would now be sipping tea under an English sky. In that odd, suspended pocket of time, the rules that had fit into propaganda posters and radio speeches began to fray. The pilot, still in the sooty residue of combat, found himself being treated not as a monster but as a fellow human, offered sustenance, warmth, and a cigarette that could have been borrowed from a neighbor. It unsettled him more than any barrage. The kindness seemed ineffably dangerous, as though affection might unravel everything he had been taught to defend. The wind had softened by the time Karl Weiß was led into the village proper. His boots, caked in Kentish clay, scuffed against cobblestone lanes lined with cottages whose roofs sagged under the weight of age and soot. Every window seemed to have a pair of eyes peering through lace curtains, faces pale with curiosity, not anger. The smell of wet earth gave way to coal smoke and the faint sweetness of baking bread. A church bell tolled somewhere beyond the square, its sound deep and calm, as if nothing unusual at all had happened. 2 Home Guard volunteers flanked him, Jack Collins on one side and Albert Finch, a wiry farmer in his 50s, on the other. Their rifles were slung but not raised. It was less a march of conquest and more a strange village procession. A captured enemy pilot walking between his captors with a tin mug of tea still clutched in his bound hands. He walked upright, every movement a deliberate performance of dignity. A boy, perhaps 10 years old, darted into view and asked, "Is he the one what dropped the bombs?" His mother hissed and pulled him back, whispering something that made the boy glance down, ashamed. Karl understood only fragments of the language, but tone needed no translation. When they reached the square, a cluster of villagers had already gathered, ARP wardens, a nurse from the local aid post, a handful of farmers. They stared not with triumph, but with a kind of tentative respect. Britain had seen hundreds of these men fall from the sky since the Battle of Britain began, but seeing one alive, breathing, and young enough to be someone's brother, someone's son, that was different. Reverend Hale reappeared, brushing soot from his sleeve. "He'll be hungry," he said simply. Mrs. Turner, still in her apron, nodded and vanished into her shop. A moment later she returned with a chipped plate of buttered toast, her hands trembling slightly. She hesitated before offering it, as though wondering whether feeding an enemy might itself be treason, then pushed the plate forward anyway. Karl looked from the plate to the faces around him. The gesture made no sense in the language of war, but he understood instinctively that refusal would be ruder than acceptance. He bowed his head slightly and murmured, "Danke." Jack Collins scratched his head. "Whatever he said, I reckon it means cheers." That drew a ripple of laughter, quiet but genuine. The tension that had hung over the crowd began to dissolve. When Sergeant Harold Pritchard, the village constable, arrived on his bicycle, he found not a mob or a manhunt, but a tableau of domestic civility. The downed German airman sat on a bench beside the post office, eating toast and sipping tea while a nurse checked the graze on his forehead. The constable blinked, uncertain whether to salute or scold. "Bloody hell, you lot have turned it into a garden party," he muttered. "Man's gotta eat," Jack replied. "Figure he won't be flying anywhere now." Pritchard sighed, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. "Right then. We'll get him to the station, notify the RAF." He turned to Karl. "You speak English, Fritz?" Karl hesitated, searching for words. "A little," he said. His accent was thick, the vowels hard-edged. "No fly. Finished." He mimed an explosion with his hands, and several villagers chuckled despite themselves. "Yeah, I can see that," Pritchard said, glancing toward the plume of black smoke still curling above the hedgerow in the distance. "Come along, then." The crowd parted, and as they walked, someone called out from the back, a man in a wool coat, likely a farmer. "What'll they do with him, then?" Pritchard shrugged. "Send him off to one of them POW camps up north, I expect. Feed him, clothe him, keep him out of trouble. War'll be over soon enough." The man nodded, though his face remained troubled. Still odd, innit? Offering tea to the blighter who was dropping bombs not 2 hours ago. Reverend Hale, walking behind them, answered softly, "It's what separates us from the madness, Mr. Griggs. We keep our decency, even when the world's lost its own." That phrase lingered in the air, like the last ring of the church bell. At the police station, a modest brick building with a single cell, Karl was searched. His pistol confiscated, his jacket hung on a peg. They found a photograph in his breast pocket. A woman and a small child standing in front of a farmhouse, both smiling. Pritchard paused, then placed it carefully back in the pocket before closing the locker. "Wife and kid?" he asked. Karl nodded. "Yeah, Hamburg." The constable exhaled slowly, tapping his pen against the ledger. "War's a bastard, son. Don't matter what side you're on." Outside, rain began to fall in light, misty threads streaking the window glass. The kettle whistled again and someone poured a second cup of tea. One for the prisoner, one for the constable. Two men from opposite sides of a burning continent sat in quiet, shared ritual. For Karl Weiß, the warmth of that chipped mug would become something he never forgot. It wasn't the tea itself that surprised him, it was what it meant. Mercy without condition, civility amid destruction. For the villagers, it was simply the English way. You put the kettle on even for your enemy, especially then. By late afternoon, the rain had turned steady. A thin gray curtain that softened the sound of the village and blurred the line between smoke and mist. The ruined Messerschmitt still smoldered in the hedgerow beyond the fields, a twisted relic that children would later sneak out to see, pocketing bits of metal as trophies. But inside the Maidstone police station, the war felt distant, almost like a rumor. Oberleutnant Karl Weiß sat on a wooden bench, his jacket drying by the stove. Steam curled from his hair and collar. He had been given a blanket, a cigarette, and another mug of tea that had long gone cold. The air smelled faintly of damp wool and pipe smoke. Outside his cell, Constable Pritchard worked through paperwork in a slow, deliberate hand, occasionally glancing up with the wary curiosity of a man trying to see past the enemy insignia. When the door creaked open, a tall man in an RAF uniform entered, Flight Lieutenant Alan Reeves, the local intelligence officer. His cap was tucked under his arm, his eyes sharp but not unkind. He looked to Pritchard. "This the German pilot they pulled out of the field?" "Aye, sir," Pritchard replied. "Name's Weiß, Karl Weiß, didn't put up a fight." Bloke barely said a word. Reeves stepped closer, his boots tapping softly on the wooden floor. "Oberleutnant Weiß," he said in measured English. "You're lucky. Most of your lot don't make it down in one piece these days." Karl looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. "Gluck," he said. "Yes, luck." Reeves studied him for a moment before nodding toward the mug. "They giving you tea?" Karl hesitated, then gave the faintest of smiles. "Tea, yes, English tea." Reeves allowed himself a short, wry chuckle. "We do that. Habit, I suppose." He gestured to the constable. "Mind if I have a word with him?" Pritchard nodded and stepped outside, leaving the door ajar. The RAF officer sat opposite Karl, removing his gloves. "I need to ask you a few questions," Reeves began, his tone professional. "Your squadron, your base of operations, mission objectives. You understand?" Karl took a slow breath. "You will ask." "I will say, name, rank, number. That is all." His voice was calm, almost resigned. "Of course," Reeves said. "Wouldn't expect anything else." For a moment, neither spoke. The rain pattered against the window, and the only other sound was the faint crackle of the fire. Then Reeves leaned forward slightly. "You've got family?" Karl hesitated. "A wife, a daughter. Elise." He spoke the name softly, as though afraid it might vanish in translation. Reeves nodded. "I've a boy. Just turned 3. Doesn't understand what all the sirens mean yet." He paused, his eyes distant for a moment. "My wife's in London. Teaches at the primary school. They were bombed last week. Half her class spent the night in a tube station." Karl's head lifted, his eyes narrowing slightly. "London," he said, his voice low. "I am sorry." Reeves blinked, taken aback by the sincerity in the man's tone. "You're sorry?" "Yes," Karl replied. "I fly because I must, but I do not hate." He struggled for the right word. "Duty, not hate." The RAF officer leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Funny thing, isn't it? We spend our days trying to kill one another, and the moment we're face to face, it all feels—" He stopped, searching for the word. "Ridiculous." Karl looked at him, the faintest flicker of something like relief in his eyes. "Yeah, ridiculous." Outside, the constable reappeared, carrying 2 more mugs of tea. "Thought you both might want topping up," he said with a grin. Reeves laughed quietly and took one. Karl hesitated before accepting his own. The 3 men, 2 British, 1 German, sat in the muted glow of the hearth, the steam from their cups rising like a fragile truce. Hours later, When the RAF truck arrived to transfer the prisoner to the detention center, the villagers gathered again by the square. The rain had stopped, leaving the cobblestones slick and shining under the dim glow of gas lamps. Karl stepped into the open, his wrists bound but his back straight. Jack Collins stood nearby, still holding his home guard armband like a talisman. "Safe trip, mate," Jack said awkwardly. "Guess this is it, eh?" Karl nodded once. "You are kind," he said, his accent softening around the words. As the truck rumbled to life, Mrs. Turner appeared once more from her shop doorway, holding out a small paper bag. "Biscuits," she said simply. "For the road." The driver hesitated, glancing toward Reeves, who gave a small nod. The bag was passed up, and Karl accepted it with both hands, bowing his head. For a moment, no one moved. The rainwater reflected their faces in the road, the enemy and the villagers, mirrored together. As the lorry pulled away, its taillights vanished into the wet mist, leaving behind the faint smell of diesel and tea. And for all who had been there that day, the memory would remain fixed not as a moment of victory but of decency, an act of ordinary English civility that seemed to mock the entire brutality of war. By the time the lorry reached the RAF detention center near Tunbridge Wells, dusk had rolled across the countryside in muted shades of gray. The air smelled of rain and engine oil, and the countryside had gone quiet save for the distant hum of Spitfires returning to base. Inside the truck's wooden compartment, Oberleutnant Karl Weiß sat opposite two British guards, young men barely 20, their uniforms too clean, their boots too large. They said little. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels filled the silence like an old clock counting down the end of something unseen. When the gates of the compound came into view, searchlights swept across the hedgerows. A sign read, "Royal Air Force Holding Station No. 7 Interrogation Unit." Behind the wire, rows of Nissan huts curved under the damp sky, each lit by dim bulbs that flickered in the mist. A sentry approached, clipboard in hand, eyes flicking between Karl and the paperwork. "Another one from Kent?" he asked. "Aye," replied the driver. "Shot down this morning. Didn't give us any trouble. Locals gave him bloody tea." The sentry raised an eyebrow but said nothing, motioning them through. Inside the barracks, the air was warm and heavy with tobacco smoke. A kettle boiled somewhere in the corner. An officer in a brown trench coat, squadron leader Douglas Keane, awaited them. He was a tidy man, with polished shoes and a face carved by the fatigue of too many sleepless nights. "Oberleutnant Weiss," he said as Karl was brought in, his German sharp and practiced. "You've had quite a day, haven't you?" Karl stood straight, offering only a nod. "I live," he said simply. Keane regarded him for a moment, then gestured toward a chair. "You'll be treated properly here. Food, medical care, somewhere to sleep. But you understand, of course, that we'll have questions." Karl met his gaze. "Name, rank, number." The officer smiled faintly. Yes. You Germans are wonderfully consistent." He poured himself tea, the sound of liquid striking china delicate amid the soft hum of the hut. "Still, you'll find the British approach a bit different than Berlin might warn you of. We're not fond of cruelty, waste of time and dignity." Karl hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Your villagers?" "Already showed this." Keane's eyes narrowed. "Ah, you mean the tea story." He sat, stirring sugar into his cup. "News travels fast here. Word's gone round that you were offered biscuits and a blanket before you'd even been disarmed." He chuckled, though there was no malice in it. "I dare say it'll confuse Goebbels no end." Karl's lips tightened, uncertain whether to smile or remain silent. "In Germany," he said slowly, "they tell us the English hate us, that you kill your prisoners. And in England," Keane replied, "they tell us the same about you." He set down the spoon with a soft clink. "Funny how lies fit both sides perfectly, isn't it?" Outside, floodlights flickered as another truck arrived, another German crew captured off the Channel coast. Through the rain-streaked window, Karl could see their faces, tired, young, blank with shock. A guard passed a cigarette to one of them before leading them inside. That night, as Karl lay in a narrow bunk beneath a wool blanket, he listened to the muffled conversations drifting through the thin walls. The guard spoke softly, joking about rations, girlfriends, the state of the weather. Ordinary things, things untouched by the machinery of war. He closed his eyes and thought of the woman from the bakery, the reverend with the thermos, the constable who had offered him tea. It was impossible to reconcile these gestures with the image he had carried in his mind. of an enemy nation built on coldness and arrogance. Miles away, in villages like Maidstone, the story of the polite German spread faster than the smoke from his wrecked aircraft. It passed from postmistress to farmer, from church pew to local pub. Some laughed at the absurdity of it. Tea for the Luftwaffe, imagine, while others, quieter, said it was proof that decency still had a place in the war. In London, newspapers began printing small columns about captured German airmen being treated humanely. The Ministry of Information approved them, carefully balancing truth with propaganda value. Civility under fire, one headline read, over a photograph of an English constable handing tea to a uniformed prisoner. The caption beneath said only, "Even our enemies find that Britain keeps her manners." In a POW camp near the Midlands, where Karl would soon be sent, word of these stories reached the prisoners, and many found them unbelievable. "They give us tea?" one pilot said, laughing bitterly. "Next they'll be inviting us to supper." But then a man at the far end of the table, gaunt, bandaged, his voice hoarse from smoke, said quietly, "No, it's true. I was there. They did." He looked down at his hands, scarred but steady. "And for the first time," he said, "I was more afraid of what kindness might do to me than any bullet." Outside, the rain began again, steady and patient, washing over roofs, hedgerows, and the still smoldering wreck of Karl Weiss's fighter in the field. Somewhere far above, unseen in the darkness, the sky rumbled faintly with the engines of bombers bound for Germany, men just like him, flying toward strangers who might one day pour them a cup of tea when the fire ended. By late October 1940, Oberleutnant Karl Weiß had been transferred to Camp No. 13, a converted estate near Derby, its lawns now fenced with barbed wire, guard towers rising where apple trees once stood. The camp had been built hastily, but the British sense of order was unmistakable. Rows of neat wooden huts, a small chapel, a recreation field marked by goalposts, even a library stocked with old English novels. For a man raised on the rigidity of Prussian discipline, there was something quietly absurd about it all. The day began with the clang of a handbell. Breakfast was served in the mess hall, porridge, tea, sometimes a slice of bread with marmalade. The guards, mostly territorial soldiers and home guard volunteers, spoke with the dry humor of men who'd seen too much of the ordinary to be impressed by war. "Morning, Jerry," one would call out, sliding a tin mug of tea across the counter. "Milk or no milk?" Karl would nod politely. "Milk, please." They had stopped flinching at one another's presence. The English found the Germans' manners strange but respectable. The Germans found their captors' patience disarming. The camp commandant, Major Thomas Graves, set the tone early. "You are prisoners," he had said on their first day, standing on the steps of the main hut, his voice even. "But you are also men. You will be treated accordingly, provided you behave accordingly." The rules were simple: roll call, work details, classes, and recreation. The Red Cross sent parcels with chocolate, cigarettes, and books. Occasionally, a visiting vicar would hold English lessons or scripture readings, attended by a mix of curiosity and boredom. Some prisoners learned to play chess. Others carved tiny wooden spitfires out of scrap timber. And always every afternoon without fail the kettle was boiled. Steam filled the air, carrying that peculiar British fragrance of tannin and comfort. Karl had once joked to his fellow officer, Lieutenant Vogel, that the entire island must float on tea. "It is their ammunition," he'd said. "It keeps them steady." But beneath the civility, a quiet tension persisted. Each side struggled with the contradictions of war and humanity. The guards knew that many of these men had bombed their cities. The prisoners knew they might have killed the families of the very people who now offered them cigarettes. And yet, when the afternoon tea was poured, none of that seemed to matter. One foggy morning, an RAF officer visited the camp, Flight Lieutenant Harold Merton, a pilot who had once been shot down over France and captured by the Germans. Now repatriated, he had volunteered to speak to the POWs as part of a psychological initiative. "War makes fools of all of us," he said to a small crowd in the yard, his arm still in a sling. "But how we treat those fools afterward, that decides whether we're still human." Karl listened in silence. When the speech ended, he approached Merton, his English halting but earnest. "You were a prisoner in Germany." "I was," Merton replied. "Not quite the same treatment, I'm afraid. But I survived." Karl hesitated. "I do not understand this," he said quietly. "You give us tea." You speak politely, even when you hate us. Merton studied him for a long moment. It isn't about hate, Oberleutnant, he said finally. It's about remembering who we were before all this started. That night, Karl wrote a letter to his wife, Anna, back in Dresden. The censors would read it, of course, but he didn't care. My dearest Anna, I am alive and treated better than I ever imagined. The English drink tea at every hour, even when the sirens wail. They are strange people, stubborn, polite, unshaken. Today I was offered a cigarette by a man whose town I may have helped destroy. He smiled when he handed it to me. I do not know how to feel about this kindness. It frightens me more than hatred would. He folded the paper neatly and handed it to the camp clerk in the morning. Outside, frost glittered on the wire fences, and the guards stamped their boots against the cold. Somewhere in the distance, the faint drone of bombers echoed, British planes heading east. In a war defined by total destruction, the quiet civility inside the camp felt almost unnatural. Yet it persisted. Guards and prisoners traded stories, learned one another's songs, even organized a small football match on Christmas Eve. The local paper would later print a single photograph. 2 teams of men in mismatched uniforms shaking hands across a muddy field. The caption read, "A different kind of victory." For Karl, that day marked something he could not name. Watching the English guard who'd offered him tea months earlier laugh and fall in the mud beside him, he realized that somewhere between the fence lines, the war had lost its power to define them completely. March 1945. The war in Europe was collapsing inward. Germany was a ruin of cities, and the Luftwaffe, once feared, was now a shadow of smoke and retreat. But in the quiet English countryside, the men behind the barbed wire still woke each morning to the same ritual. Roll call, porridge, tea. The guns thundered hundreds of miles away, yet the civility within Camp No. 13 endured like a stubborn light against the dark. On that cold March morning, a letter arrived for Oberleutnant Karl Weiß. It was stamped with the familiar eagle insignia and bore the jagged handwriting of his brother, Erich, a soldier on the Eastern Front. The contents were grim. Dresden had burned. Their family home was gone. No word of Anna. Karl folded the letter with trembling fingers and walked outside. The air smelled of wet earth and coal smoke, drifting faintly from the nearby village. He sat by the fence, staring into the fog. A guard noticed him. Corporal George Benton, a broad-shouldered man with a gentle way about him. Benton said nothing at first, only approached with the slow familiarity of one who'd learned when to speak and when to stay silent. After a moment, he reached into his greatcoat and pulled out a battered tin mug. "Tea?" he asked softly. Karl looked up. His eyes were red but dry. "Yes," he whispered. The corporal poured from a thermos, the steam curling between them like a living thing. They drank without words, 2 men separated by wire and allegiance, yet bound by the simple mercy of warmth. When Benton offered a cigarette, Karl accepted, not out of need, but out of gratitude. Across the camp that evening, small acts like this repeated themselves. Guards offered letters, prisoners shared songs, and even as the war twisted toward its violent end, something profoundly human persisted. The camp had become a strange pocket of sanity, a place where decency survived against all logic. When the surrender finally came in May, it arrived not with fanfare but with a single radio broadcast played through the mess hall loudspeakers. Churchill's voice, resolute and weary, filled the air. "Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight." The prisoners stood in silence. Some wept, others smiled faintly. The guards removed their caps. In that hush, the world seemed to hold its breath. The following days were a blur of orders and logistics. Repatriation lists were drawn. Camp gates, long symbols of division, were opened for the first time in nearly 5 years. But there was no rush toward freedom, only quiet disbelief. Karl packed his belongings, a few photographs, a carved wooden Spitfire, and the mug Corporal Benton had given him as a parting gift. As he approached the main gate, Benton extended a hand once more. "Safe journey, mate," he said, his accent rough but sincere. Karl hesitated. "You offered me tea when I was your enemy," he said quietly. "I will not forget that," Benton smiled. "Then we both learned something, didn't we?" They shook hands, a gesture small in action but vast in meaning. For Karl, that handshake felt heavier than the medals he had once worn. Years later, long after he returned to Germany, he would tell his children about it. He would speak not of aerial duels or military glory, but of the strange dignity found in the heart of war. How the British, whose cities his bombs had scarred, had treated him not as a monster but as a man. And always, he would end with the same image: a muddy English field, a tin mug of tea, and an enemy soldier who offered warmth instead of hatred. In that memory, in that quiet, improbable act, the war had in some small way already ended.